Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable on topic AI and pandemic, co-organized by the University of Mons and FARID, so the AI for the Common Good Institute. This roundtable happens in the context of the European AI Week 2022. Before diving into the roundtable in itself, I have first the honor to welcome Professor Philippe Dubois, the rector of UMons, for introductory words. So, Professor Dubois, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Can you hear me? Excellent, excellent. Good evening, everybody. Hope you're good. Seems for the people I can see the face through the screen. Happy to welcome you for these introduction words. For sure, as rector of UMons, I'm very pleased to introduce this roundtable on a very much attractive topic, AI and pandemics, within the European AI Week. Actually, and even co-organized by UMons, as Pierre said, UMons, but also FARID, AI for the Common Good Institute, ULB, VUB, GV, if I can say. As everyone knows, fighting against a pandemic is a very difficult challenge. And in this context, I do guess it is crucial to leverage the full potential of new technologies, such as, among others, AI, artificial intelligence. Indeed, and I'm sure that you will be sharing that point with me, many aspects of a pandemic can benefit from the support of AI. This is the case, for instance, for the epidemiological modeling, for the contact tracing, but also, I guess, the identification for contamination clusters, and also for the fast development of mRNA vaccines, or as a last example, for the diagnosis based on chest CT scans, as we investigated a little bit in our own labs. But using AI for such health applications cannot be done without considering the ethical and legal issues, the trade-off between privacy and efficiency. More importantly, from my point of view, we need to base ourselves on the lessons learned during COVID-19 to strengthen the interleaving of all the scientific disciplines involved in the fight against a pandemic and build an efficient and, I would say, reliable framework that also guarantees civic, and I'm insisting, civic engagement. Now, being said that, I want to highlight the other events organized and mostly co-organized during this week, this AI week at UMons. First of all, it's important to know that this AI week happens simultaneously within the Brain Awareness Week and the PhD month at UMons. All of them are really dynamics in which our university is highly involved, but not alone, in collaboration, as I said before. Tomorrow afternoon, we'll be organizing an internal face-to-face event that aims to meet the view from the AI experts on the one end, and on the other end, the life science experts. The goal of this event is to get a better understanding of how AI can be exploited in biological as well as medical applications. What are the difficulties commonly faced during such projects from now? What are the possibilities in terms of new interdisciplinary work? And that's something I really like as not a rector, but as a scientist. I myself, I'm a chemist active in material science, what I like calling the cross-fertilization between different disciplines aiming at reaching one main unique target. We are really delighted to count more than 60 registrations, both from students and scientific staff, And later, online at 8 p.m., there will be a trans-university conference of Boris Cyrulnik on the different types of memories. Finally, on Thursday evening, again at 8 p.m., Brain and Artificial Intelligence will gather for a conference on the contributions of AI in medicines with a particular focus on pain related to musculoskeletal disorder. First, Giovanni Brigandi, hello Giovanni, chair of the AI for Health Working Group, will give a state of the art of the applications of AI in medicine. Then the focus will be done on the Interact Nomad project and more specifically on AI for the diagnosis of neck pain and low back pain. I think this schedule looks very much promising and will bring for sure a lot of inspiring discussions. Now, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Hans de Kangt, co-head of FARI, who will give a quick overview of some AI-based initiatives launched to fight against COVID-19, but also to tackle all related challenges. Thank you very much and enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Philippe, for these kind words, and welcome everybody here, also on YouTube, watching the broadcasted stream. Looking forward to this this session, of course, as co-lead of FARI. We have, with the Institute in collaboration between ULB and VUB, experts across different disciplines in Brussels, decided to also put, of course, health and well-being at the forefront of the Institute. And already last year, we saw, of course, in our both universities, that the pandemic situation has actually made boundaries fade. And that's something that I think is a generic thing that we can actually see, that also in fighting the pandemic, immediately between scientists, across universities, inside universities, across university, on regional level, trans-regional level, disciplines were looking to each other and trying to collaborate. And I think that that's something that is also at the core of not only the FARI Institute, but I think also the core of the future of AI research, and specifically if you look at AI technology that is needed and well needed in the area of healthcare and well-being. We've seen it, so in so many examples, collaborating our experts like Hugues Derseny with COCOM on Brussels regional level to indeed help in finding the right prediction models at one hand, but also in other initiatives that, for example, were taken in the engineering department, looking for open source models and finding robotics techniques in helping to develop open source respiration solutions. So it's in all different types of fields that we've seen that people were looking for collaborations. And I think that's something that, of course, not only in regional level, but of course, trans-regional on a Belgian level. We have seen so many experiments, projects being lifted off. I think, for example, the iCovid-19 project, collaboration between KU Leuven, VUB, also the UZ Jette and other university hospitals in Belgium and also across Europe, that actually made it clear that these boundaries that we are still living in today, in a discipline level, but also in a national and policy level, were of course to be broken if we wanted to find these solutions, and specifically data-related solutions where also AI came into place. Transnational boundaries, then this brings me to also Claire, and we're actually co-hosting and co-organizing this session also on behalf of the European CLARE Network for AI Research Laboratories. And immediately right after the pandemic, the CLARE network established a task force on AI and pandemics. And immediately became clear that many different types of expertise in the field of AI were willing to join forces. And there were different separate task forces being developed. People from robotics, people from computer vision, people come from indeed epidemiology and prediction models. And we have seen that indeed over the different regions in Europe, the willingness to collaborate over the boundaries of nations or regions and universities with different backgrounds immediately took place. And I think what the session of today will show to everybody attending here is that working on these boundaries and making them disappear, I think that we as scientists have to play an important role there and actually can show to politicians what are the means and needs and how to actually solve potential political boundaries that were sometimes a roadblock in finding solutions in the different fields. And I think that we all have contributed to that, but will need to continue to contribute to that, specifically in the field of AI, because we see that AI is everywhere. You know, there are no such things when dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic that are limited to specific aspects of our lives. COVID-19 was 24/7 in our environment, in social media, regular media, and that was also playing a part in how to fight the pandemics. So when you discuss AI and pandemics, it's not only about indeed prediction models, it's not only about analysis of for example, CT scans or images or finding the solution of the right vaccine. It was also a problem about information, disinformation, where also AI came into play. So it was a very complex situation where we, I think also thanks to AI, have found a lot of solutions. And I'm happy to give the floor to the expert panel to discuss these different aspects together with you. And I hope that this is a good start of the rest of the AI week, where we also can find in the area of health a lot of other examples of a promising future that AI can bring for health and well-being. So enjoy the session, and Pierre will give you the floor to start the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Hans, and thank you also to Professor Dubois. So now, indeed, we are going to go to the roundtable. And first, let me introduce the 6 panelists that we have for this roundtable today. So first, we have Professor Anne Noé, who is head of the AI lab at the VUB, and who is also the leader of the epidemiological data analysis topic group in the CLARE COVID-19 initiative. We have also Professor Effie Vaiena, who is professor of bioethics at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology at ETHZ in Zurich, in Switzerland, and who is also the chair of the WHO COVID-19 expert ethics group. We have also Dr. Magda Zwierzina, who is AI and machine learning lead scientist in the Vaccines Research and Development Department at GSK. Then for the men, we have Professor Paul Suetens, who is Professor Emeritus at KU Leuven, and who is also the co-chair of the Global Partnership on AI COVID-19 Task Force. We have Professor Simon Delicaud, who is FRS FNRS Research Associate at the University of Brussels, the ULB, and who is also a visiting professor at the University of Leuven, the KUL. And finally, we have Jonathan Thibault, who is a researcher in machine learning and AI applied to contact tracing at the KU Leuven. So as far as I'm concerned, I will moderate this roundtable, and I'm a PhD student in applied mathematics at the Polytechnic Faculty of Humans. So just before starting, I would like to say to the general public attending to this roundtable, either on Zoom or on YouTube, that you can ask whenever you want your questions into the chat. And there will be a Q&A session just after the roundtable, so feel free to ask your questions. So actually, the roundtable will be split in three main parts, three main sections. So the first one will discuss the technical aspects, so namely how AI was used to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. Then in the second section, we will focus on the decision-making, legal and ethical aspects. And finally, in the last part of this roundtable, we will turn ourselves towards the future and wonder what lessons can be learned from the COVID-19 pandemic to be able to leverage AI in the future to manage at best a crisis like this one. So maybe to start with, I will propose to Professor Suetens to give in a few words a definition of AI, and maybe to sketch also the main aspects of the pandemic that were actually dealt with AI.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre, for the clear introduction. And as a co-chair of the Working Group AI and Pandemic Response of the GPA, and GPA stands for Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, we decided to use the OECD definition of artificial intelligence. And that states that an AI system is a machine-based system that is capable of influencing the environment by producing an output such as predictions, recommendations, decisions for a given set of objectives. And this definition is quite broad and allowed us to include not only the data-hungry algorithms, but also, for example, mathematical or statistical models with a fairly limited number of parameters. And that was necessary when we identified the AI initiatives that were built for this pandemic. And in fact, we identified 66 promising and technically sound AI initiatives to aid in a COVID-19 response. And we conducted assessments of the intrinsic potential of the AI initiatives to mitigate this and future pandemics and their scalability, and narrowed the 66 identified initiatives further into a short list of 26. And we distinguished 3 domains of initiatives, namely the biological, the clinical, and the societal domain. And examples in the biological domain are, for example, predict the shapes of proteins. An example of that is AlphaFold, built by DeepMind. In the medical domain, examples are the detection of the presence of COVID-19 in chest CT scans, or viewing the occupancy rates of hospitals and recommendations for patient transfers. And in the societal domain, and that's by far the majority of AI initiatives that were built for to mitigate this pandemic, we found examples like providing users with personalized daily COVID-19 risk scores associated with regular activities and protect their health and the health of others. And this enables health authorities to take targeted actions to prevent future outbreaks. Example of that is Covey, contact tracing app built by the Miller Group in Montreal in Canada. Another example in the societal domain is to determine the effectiveness of non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs for short, on COVID-19, such as wearing masks and limiting contacts, and assist the government in making informed decisions. And there are several such applications available. And a third example I want to give to you is identification, tracking, and analyzing events associated with COVID-19 via online news articles and social media posts, such as Blue Dot, for example. I can continue with that, and actually we found 26 very interesting and mature in AI initiatives that were particularly built for this pandemic, and maybe in the future of this panel discussion, we will encounter several of them. But that's in short how we viewed AI and how we subdivided applications of COVID-19 to mitigate the pandemic.
Yes, indeed, with this definition of AI, I think you've already given the outline of the next part of this roundtable. So indeed, now we will focus more precisely on the technical aspects, so on how AI was used concretely, and we will go more in details in some examples that you have just cited right now. So maybe first let us focus on the epidemiological part, and maybe I will ask Professor Noé, as she was a member of the CARE COVID-19 initiative. How can we use the epidemiological data by using artificial intelligence, and maybe how can we model and project the dynamics of an epidemic like COVID-19 in this context?
Okay, thank you. So indeed, AI has been shown to be very helpful in getting better models of how the epidemic was spreading. So one of the aspects was to use AI to better understand how variants were occurring and spreading, but also on how the virus was spreading within a population. So AI can be used to better understand mobility patterns, social networks, this kind of things. But also within AI, we can contribute in providing more accurate models. So in epidemics, there used to be, let's say, useful but quite simple models. But with using techniques of AI, and then more specifically like agent-based models. So we really then model, let's say in Belgium, around 11 million individuals and how they move around. That results in more accurate models on how the disease can spread, because we cannot only do this for COVID, for example, but we could also do similar things for other diseases as well. So these models then or more, let's say, realistic, more accurate, and they can model reality in a more accurate way. Of course, they have to be calibrated, and this is something you typically also do with epidemiologists and biostatisticians, of course. Hans already highlighted the need for interdisciplinary collaboration. But then once you have this more accurate models, you actually face another aspect. So it's not only about modeling, but then it's also about, how can you now use this more complex models to come to decisions? And also there, AI has played an important role in optimizing decision strategies, prevention strategies. So for example, through the use of reinforcement learning, this is what we have seen in this pandemic, that these modeling as well as decisions optimization has come together to help to fight the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. And I come back on what you said. You said that there is a clear need for interdisciplinarity in such problems. And in this panel, we have the chance to have an epidemiologist, Professor Delicourt. And so maybe, Professor Delicourt, what do you think about the use of AI compared to let's say, old-fashioned or other kinds of methods that can be used in epidemiological science? And what do you think are the related challenge of using AI in such research? Let's say?
So yeah, first, I think that as Professors Sutens and Noe introduced, artificial intelligence approaches have many applications in epidemiology. And yeah, just for instance, one of them is allowing the estimation of complex nonlinear relationships between a response variable and several predictive candidate variables. And this is even possible to use this kind of approach when you have, a lot of multicollinearities between those different variables. So even for a simple application like that, a machine learning approach can already help epidemiologists to establish complex relationships between variables. But as they introduce, there are even more complex applications for artificial intelligence in general. And I think that indeed there are a lot of subfields in epidemiology where this kind of complex tools can have interesting applications. But my personal feeling is that I don't have the impression that the limitation lies in the availability or the accessibility of such approaches, but rather on the possibility to set up a good collaborative and interdisciplinary framework. And this is also something that my colleagues mentioned. It's important to have all the people around the table. So I will take a concrete example. Let's say that some analysts are working on the positive cases, so on the evolution of COVID-19 cases. We all know that this important metric is actually impacted by the evolution of the testing strategy, which is evolving through time in terms of capacity, but also in terms of criteria used to define who should be tested. So if someone is only using those data without knowing the origin and potential bias associated with the data collection, the different conclusions could be wrong. So I think that this is very important to have a strong connection between people working on the field, people knowing those metrics, and people having particular analytical skills, like people working in artificial intelligence or machine learning. So my colleagues also mentioned that one of the key aspects is the interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary aspect. And that's still a challenge in this crisis. Maybe we have the opportunity to come back later, but I think that a lot of tools are available right now. And some of those tools are even implemented in some more or less user-friendly interfaces or user-friendly tools. And even epidemiologists could actually use them at the moment. But even if they have an access to those tools, I think this is also important for them to be in contact with people developing those tools, to know also the limitations of the application. So as a quick summary for this first intervention, I would say that we need a lot of contact between all the different parties involved.
Yes, thank you, Professor Delicourt. And I think that among the tools that you mentioned, one of the most interesting one is maybe one that could help for contact tracing. And I will turn to Jonathan, who is expert in this topic. So how is it possible to use AI for contact tracing, and maybe is it possible to be more efficient by using AI in this context? Is it possible maybe to take more focused sanitary measures than what could be expected without AI?
So yes, the contact tracing has actually two different goals. On one hand, we aim at breaking the transmission chain by isolating the contacts of positive cases, and on the other hand, we aim at monitoring the evolution of the pandemic. And artificial intelligence can actually serve those two purposes. So on the one hand, we can enhance the classical contact tracing methodology. And so instead of calling every positive case so that they give their contacts and then calling every context, which is like very time consuming, we can try to at least partially automate this methodology. And as you probably know, some mobile applications have been developed which are using some wireless technologies such as Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. And this is namely the case of Corona Alert in Belgium. Indeed, this application can actually notify a user if he has been in contact with a positive case, so that this person can actually isolate himself if needed. Then another research team has also used some Wi-Fi signal to actually train a machine learning algorithm to predict if someone was close to a positive case or not in a building. So to do so, they collected different features, and namely from which access point the signal, the Wi-Fi signals came from towards their smartphone, but also the intensity of the signal, which means that if a positive case has an intensity which is similar to someone else and that comes from the same access point, it means that this person can actually be close to the positive case. And so such a model has been trained with this data to predict this close contact. Moreover, an application has been developed in Canada which is called Covey, and this application, by using wireless technologies like this, is also able to predict the probability of being infected and also to predict how contagious you are if you are infected. Then, on the other hand, artificial intelligence is also very useful to monitor the pandemic, and it's even sometimes needed. Indeed, for instance, at KU Leuven, we are gathering some contact tracing data, such as the symptoms onset date and also the events every positive cases attended. With this data, we can therefore, for instance, compute the incubation period, which is a key parameter to monitor the pandemic. But the problem is that sometimes the incubation period is defined as the interval time between the date of infection and the date of development of symptoms. But the problem is that someone could actually attend different events, and so we cannot just compute a difference between two dates. So we are going to use artificial intelligence techniques to actually estimate the incubation period. And so to do so, we'll consider different scenarios and build a Markov decision model to actually see if there is a convergence toward an average, a fixed average incubation period value. Such an application, so such an algorithm, the Markov chain, can also be used to compute the generation interval in a similar way. And the generation interval is the time between a parent COVID is infected and a child COVID is infected. So the child which is infected by the parent. Then moreover, the Covey applications, the Canadian application, can also use can build some epidemiological model to try to spot the geographical areas with rapid infections, or also the area in which people are following the governmental recommendation, and also to try to determine which are the factors which actually matter for contagions. And finally, the contact tracing dataset can also be used to train other machine learning algorithms. For instance, in Leuven, since the start of the pandemic, we are gathering some textual description of events. And as we know that in some events, some positive cases have been found, we actually train an algorithm which is able to, based on free text mining, assess if an event is a high-risk event or not. And so an event is labeled as a high-risk event if there is at least one positive case. So this is a summary of applications that can be performed related to contact tracing.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. It's really interesting to see how diverse the applications of AI are for the COVID-19 pandemic. Another aspect of the applications of AI in the context of the COVID was the healthcare, actually. as Professor Sutton said at the beginning, you can use the AI to make the diagnosis of COVID-19 based on the chest CT scans. And so maybe Professor Sutton, could you give a bit more details about these techniques and how it was used concretely in the hospitals during the pandemic?
Okay, yes. Before I became a co-chair of the working group AI and pandemics in GPA, I coordinated the pro bono Belgian initiative iCovid, and that was from March 2020 till September 2020. And that resulted in a cloud-based AI solution for the quantitative analysis of COVID-19 lesions in chest CT scans. And such lesions are color-coded in the CT scans and mapped to a severity score, which can aid the radiologist to make an informed diagnosis quicker and quantitatively. So the tool can be used in time-critical situations such as triaging, and that was the case in the initial phase of the pandemic, or to complement the diagnosis options such as PCR test, because in the first days, the PCR test is not 100% sensitive, or for medical follow-up, for example. However, we encountered several issues that slowed down the development of that tool. And I give you 3 of them. The first one is the adoption and credibility of the AI tool. So medical professionals want to be able to understand the decision-making process, and that was not the case. And there is also concern around the use and collection of sensitive healthcare data, and in particular cloud-stored data. So that was a cloud-based tool. And yeah, for some reason, especially in Germany, there was a serious concern about that. The second issue was the access to reliable data and the radiologists' annotations for training, which was not readily available. Available data sets were often characterized as insufficient, incomplete, context-dependent, quickly evolving, and in general, this is also challenged by misinformation. And then a third issue was the ethical and legal barriers to be compliant with existing data protection and privacy regulations. That it takes time. So it's a very time-consuming procedure, and there exist different data privacy regulations around the world, and also discussions on the interpretation of the GDPR, the impact of retrospective versus prospective studies, and regulatory aspects of pseudonymization versus anonymizations, all resulted in delaying and time-consuming ping-pong between lawyers and data protection officers in different hospitals. So to give you an idea, from these 6 months, I spent half of my time in solving or trying to solve at least these issues instead of trying to build and to help building a technical AI solution.
Okay, yes, thank you. And do you think that I mean that the medical staff is enough trained to use AI?
No. Well, the medical staff doesn't. They don't trust it. They want to understand what the system does, but if it's based on deep learning, it's at this moment still not very easy to explain how the results are produced. Okay, you have all kinds of research around that topic so it's about explainable AI, but in such a short time, it was not possible to build a system that could explain itself how the lesions were found. So they don't trust it, and that was the problem of the medical staff. but you also had the DPOs in the hospitals and the lawyers in the hospital who use their traditional way of work and all the rules and laws that exist around new applications and studies. And to give you an idea, we had to contact the sick people when we wanted to use their chest CT scans, but some of them were already left the hospital. Some of them were even died. So we had to contact the family, and in such a short time, it was really not possible to do. So it's not only the medical people, it's also everything. Yeah, everybody surround the new studies and so on, and that that slowed down the development of such a tool. I hope that in the future we can avoid that and we learn from these lessons here.
Yes, it's definitely a lesson to learn for the future. And another interesting application of AI for the pandemic, of course, is the development of vaccines, of treatments for the patients. And we have the chance in this panel to have Magda Zverzina, who works at GSK. So maybe Magda, can you tell a bit more about how you can leverage AI to develop vaccines in a short amount of time? And how can you combine this with human expertise, and how can you guarantee that such vaccines are efficient?
Yes, of course. Thank you. So, I mean, first of all, AI is really used at every single stage of vaccine research and development. So, we use AI to design vaccines, to identify interesting antigens, alongside things like more traditional maybe methods from computational biology. AI is used to predict things like formulations that will keep the vaccine stable as it travels from, manufacturing plant to a patient's arm. Then later in the development, we have things like digital twins that are these sort of machine learning models that run alongside the manufacturing process and help manage it. We use AI to manage the supply chain, which is hugely important, especially during the pandemic. And so there's lots and lots of applications. But I think an interesting thing to focus on the context of this pandemic is really the emergence of the new kind of vaccine, the mRNA vaccine. So the platform which is behind vaccines like Moderna and Pfizer, which have been given to millions of people, and they're currently saving lots of lives and economies around the world. Now, if you think about what's the difference between these two vaccines, it's really one of the most important differences is really the RNA sequence, which from the point of view of using the AI, or from the point of view of a data scientist, is hugely, hugely exciting, because sequences are something we are very much used to work with. It's like code, it's pure information. So we can use sequence models that have been developed for completely different applications, like natural language processing, to design vaccines. Now, let me tell you a little bit why it's actually important. So, mRNA vaccines are meant to produce in our cells a protein. In case of COVID, there will be a spike protein that is exactly the same as the virus, so that our immune system can then recognize the virus itself. But the way human genetic code works is that for any single protein, you have a huge number of possible RNA sequences, and it's not that obvious which one we should be using. So to give you just one example, the example of spike, there are 10 to the power of 632 different RNA sequences that code for exactly the same spike. And it's a huge number. It's more than, number of atoms in the universe, more than number of possible chess games. And all these different sequences, they may have different properties. They may show different stability profile. They may produce proteins more efficiently, and some of them might not even work in the human cells. So out of this huge number of possibilities, only 2 are currently on the market. And of course, this is not based on experiments. We cannot possibly test all these possible vaccines in experiments. This is just impossible. But actually what we can do is to use data-driven models to design for a given protein sequence, design RNA sequence that is most likely to work and have the right properties before we run the experiments. And in fact, companies like Moderna, they spent years and years developing their computational models for RNA sequence design, such that when the pandemic hit, they were essentially ready in 2 days with a candidate that could be pushed into production, because they had into production because this is how high their confidence in the model was. Now, you asked about how AI can be used, how it can kind of augment human expertise, and this is a very important question. And we think about it. I think that it's very much just a tool, but a very powerful tool, and really the most important thing it does is that it can be used by scientists to accelerate their research. So it can, because at the end of the day, we always need to run experiments, and of course, randomized clinical trials are the most important thing we need to do to understand whether our vaccine work and whether they're safe. But with AI, what we can do is to run less experiments and run experiments in such a way, on a reduced number of candidates, having bigger confidence and probability that one of them will be an attractive vaccine. So I'd say it's very, very complementary to human expertise.
Yeah, thank you, Magda. I think this is definitely something promising for the future too, using AI for the development of vaccines. And maybe very quickly, beyond this vaccination question, are there other impacts on the pharmaceutical industry that the pandemic had, and where AI could also be used, maybe?
Oh yes, thank you. It's an excellent question. So like for most industries, COVID has been hugely disruptive for pharmaceutical industry, not only because of changes in or challenges to supply chain and workforces not being able to come to work, but I think one aspect of pharmaceutical industry activity that was particularly hit are clinical trials, which are of course hugely important. And of course, when we think about the world in 2020, we think about COVID, but other diseases did not go away, and was really important that research for diseases such as cancer, continues being is continuing. And if you think about this, to run a clinical trial, you need tens of hospitals across essentially in many countries, many continents, hundreds perhaps of clinical staff, and thousands of volunteers, of course. And all of this has been challenged during the pandemic. So hospitals either were closed, like maybe they were overwhelmed with COVID. Patients didn't want to participate in clinical trials. They wouldn't even leave home. They wouldn't want to go to the hospital. And it was, hugely disruptive in terms of just running clinical trials for things like cancer. And so it's actually from my own work at GSK, we did use AI to develop completely new models to help study teams essentially develop their contingency plans and understand how COVID is going to develop in different countries, and how it's going to impact clinical trial recruitment. And so we went through data that we discussed today, things like epidemiological data to model COVID trajectories, things like non-pharmaceutical interventions, like, whether there was a mandate for people to stay at home or not, which is very impactful in terms of, people's participation in clinical trials. And we built completely data-driven models to support clinical trial recruitment during the pandemic. And I think this is just one of the examples where, AI has been used very, very in a very agile way to help in the situation. So thank you, great question.
Okay, thank you, Magda. This is an interesting aspect to know also. So now I think we can move to the second part of this roundtable, which is more focused on the decision-making, legal and ethical aspects of the pandemic. So for now, we had covered the technical aspects, but now we can switch to these other very important aspects also. So first, maybe Professor Vaiana, what are the main ethical challenges actually that are linked with the use of digital applications, and more especially AI, of course, in the context of a pandemic?
Thank you. I think I'd like to treat this question more generally than more specifically to AI, because I think a lot of the fundamental challenges are at the level of data, and these are important for many different types of digital applications, including the artificial intelligence work that we're more interested in here. So I think what we saw in the pandemic is that we still, although there's been a lot of work and a lot of scholarship and a lot of regulation around particularly health data, we still saw challenges in regards to the provenance of data that we want to use. It was mentioned earlier, those questions of provenance have caused a variety of issues. It's not only if we're allowed to use certain data for certain purposes, it is also whether we have comprehensive data that if we don't, we come quickly back to the issues of bias and problems with our analysis. And that is an issue that we see in non-crisis environments, but also in a crisis environment or an emergency where we're really in need to do things quickly and we don't have the luxury of time to go through all the processes that we possibly have when we are in a non-crisis modus. So I think what the pandemic made clear is that despite the progress we have made, we're still having unresolved issues in the governance of health data. And I'm just putting the boundaries around health data here. If we expand, I think we have more challenges. Another thing that became, I think, interesting to me at least was beyond the questions of provenance and consent and bias was what is our oversight mechanisms for those things. In some cases, we have some laws and we can, say that's legally right or not. But what I'm talking about is the oversight process that allows a more reflexive and more dynamic approach when we're doing this. And I think the oversight question was also very interesting in the projects that we already mentioned, particularly the contact tracing, the proximity and digital proximity and contact tracing one. So these are some of the basics, I would say, and I deliberately left privacy further down because I think privacy is the one issue that comes up into in our minds when we're talking about data, specifically of health data. I think we tend to think that given the progress we've made in data protection regulation, that we sort of have dealt with privacy to a certain extent. But again, what we saw during the pandemic is this is even if we have made that progress, still we have lots of questions and lots of issues that come up in the space of data protection and in privacy. And when we're talking more broadly about digital applications, one thing that at least I believe is an important concern, and I would put it under ethical concerns, is the evidence that we have about effectiveness of applications. Now, it depends really on what exactly we're talking about here, whether the application is enabled through artificial intelligence or not, but I'm referring to any type of digital health application. I think we have a question of evidence of effectiveness, because that's what we want when we are developing these technologies in the space of clinical care, but also in public health. And the question here, I think, is double. What kind of evidence is it suitable for this to demonstrate effectiveness here, and do we have it? And I think we have challenges in both of those aspects. So I would say, and the last thing I wanted to raise as well is, again, under the rubric of ethical concerns, for me is the way in which we, and I have to qualify what is we, communicate with citizens or with patients about those kinds of developments in terms of, not only what they accept, but also what they would like to see, or what is that would make these types of technologies the kinds that they trust and they want to use. And I believe the pandemic was also quite enlightening in many ways about how we do that in terms of our citizenry. How are they involved or not, and how we approach the communication in relation to these technologies. So that's, in a very, very sort of, telegraphic, I would say, way, the list of ethical concerns that I would put on the table.
Thanks a lot, Professor Vallena. And maybe I can ask the same question, let's say, to Professor Noe, based on what Professor Vallena says. Do you think that there should be some kind of trade-off between developing applications that are efficient in terms of Earth, let's say, but at the price of some reduced data privacy? And what about the social acceptance also of this kind of trade-off and of choice?
Yeah, okay, thank you for the question. Should, in the sense of I would say, before we make them, we should at least reflect on them. Privacy should be protected for good reasons, but we also have to then say, okay, if we have such a privacy preserving, for example, Corona alert, what will that mean? What will that monitor? And what will be the limits of the system? So before we develop it, we can already calculate the consequences. So at some point last June, I've written a small article on this with a colleague on DOMS. When the Corona measures were going to be relaxed, well, you can easily calculate that if you have a Corona alert that preserves privacy and that doesn't take context of these contexts into account, again, for good reasons, and that you can just, by basic mathematics, calculate that all these alerts will just spread much faster than the virus, and in a few days, everybody will be in quarantine, which is okay in the sense of that you have to make the choices as a society. So if you ask me, should we make trade-offs? No, well, yes, but in the sense of that we should reflect about this as a society. What do we want? And then, yeah, there's consequences to certain choices, and maybe we then should not make this kind of apps if they then turn out not to be efficient in certain situations. So it's all about what does society wants, and that should be at the core of developing this technology.
And do you think that the decision makers are enough mature and trained to promote, let's say, the use of AI at such large scale and such a situation, such a crazy situation?
Well, I was a bit surprised that in this whole discussion on which apps were okay from an ethical privacy point of view, that nobody actually calculated the consequences of making a certain decision, and then come to the conclusion that these apps, if they would have been used by sufficient number of people, which was then very often, and like 70% of the population should use them, well, then you had just the consequence that then, and there would be so many alerts, and if people would react to these alerts, people would just be sitting at home all the time, and yeah, that's again a consequence of making a certain choice, but too many people were talking about sufficiently number of people should use these apps, while, and there was, yeah, the other side of the coin, so to say, if everybody was going to use them, we had another problem. So then, yeah, my question would be, when is this really useful to have such technology? So maybe we shouldn't develop it at all. That's a bit my point I want to make here.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And maybe, Prof. Vallena, do you have something to add about it? And maybe, how do you think it's possible to guarantee some social acceptance of such applications?
Yeah, I think at least my lesson from the contact tracing apps was that we did put a lot of emphasis on privacy preservation, and I think a lot of the debate, at least in my circles, initially was, is this going to be privacy preserving, and how we can, make sure that there's no issue with data protection. And I think that was achieved, which is interesting then to see that the adoption rates, at least in Europe, in most countries, were low. Now, I don't think we have a systematic empirical data on why people chose not to use the technologies, and I'm not sure that we could say, well, if they had used them, then they would all stay home. Well, maybe that's what we should have done in order to stop transmission. So, the question is also, what's the purpose? And maybe the purpose is something that requires certain things to be done. But I think that the problem. When we just throw a technology out there to people and say, use it, that's great. Look, we protect your privacy. It seems to me that's not going to suffice for people. I think we need to do more than that. One of the things that we certainly didn't do well is to try to understand what exactly are they worried about, why is it just privacy, or is it privacy, or is it more? We also, I think, didn't do a terrific job in integrating this particular application. Maybe in some countries it was better than others, in the entire system of response. I mean, it's important. It's nice to have one tool, but how does this tool work within the rest of your response to a crisis? Does it plug into the other pieces, to the quarantine measures, or to the compensation for things, or to the availability of tests, or whatever it is, it's time that we need to do. So just having a technology alone and then expect that this is going to be the magic bullet, I think it's not working. So we need a more dynamic relationship with people, so we understand both what people want, what they're worried about, what they're concerned, what they can adjust to, and work with them. I think what we saw in the pandemic, with the excuse, well, we don't have time, people are dying, we got to do something right away, which I understand is a very strong argument. Still, I think we should have set up processes in place that allow for this more dynamic relationship that it seems to me wasn't here in this case.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I see the time is quite flying, but no, I think we can slightly move to the last part of this roundtable, and actually wonder what can be done in the future, and what can be the lesson learned from this crisis for the future, and how can we improve the use of AI in such situations. So maybe actually we can see that there are some structural limitations, and I would like to ask Professor Delicourt, how do you think that we should proceed in terms of collaboration, as you said at the beginning? Maybe how is it possible to put all the experts around the same table, to gather them, and to promote a transdisciplinary approach?
That's a very good question. My impression is that the initiative could come from the universities. So we need to have a network of scientists that could be activated, and we need an interdisciplinary network. So the universities gathering a lot of different researchers could be the starting point for that. And the other issue that should be solved is the accessibility to the data. I think that we indeed lose a lot of time, establishing data transfer agreements. And of course, I understand why. Data privacy issues are very important, and we need to deal with them. But I think on the other hand, we should somehow team up with experts in that domain to have the shortest delay toward the accessibility of those data. And also the fact that everything is centralized at the moment. So if we talk, for instance, about the data collected by Censano, only a very small proportion of the scientific community has access to those data. And the choice of the research teams that could access those data is not very transparent. And I think for future crises like this, it would be important to have a more transparent system to deliver a data transfer agreement to the different teams. And yeah, I think that if we have a network that can be activated, for which there are already a pre-agreement on the data transfer, that would speed up the entire process. Let's say that we have to, the challenge here is to be able to fully exploit the data available in a very short amount of time. And if we want to do that, we have to be able to gather the good team around the data. And by a good team, I mean people with various skills and various skills and expertise. And the data have to become available as soon as possible. And to do that, we have to think about a framework that could pre-exist this kind of crisis. So for the next pandemic, that would be even better to have the impression in Belgium that all the people ready to analyze those data with various skills and expertise could, in a month or a couple of weeks, being able to gather around the same table with the data at the center of that table. So I think that, to summarize, accessibility to data is one big issue, and a kind of centralization to constitute those teams with various skills is also important. And there, I think that the network of Belgian universities, if we talk about Belgium, or ECDC in Europe, but at the Belgian scale, I think that the universities are a good starting point for that.
Okay, thank you, Professor Delicourt. I will bounce on the two aspects that you mentioned. Maybe first with Jonathan. Sorry. In terms of the availability of the data, how do you think that it's possible to work with data sets in an emergency situation? What are the challenges? What are the difficulties? What are the possibilities?
Yes, so I think it's definitely possible to actually work in a data set in an emergency situation, but only under certain conditions. And the first one is that the data that you are using needs to be useful. And to be useful, I think we have to gather this kind of data in real time. And to do so, we need to gather data in a very rapid and efficient way. And so, for instance, at KU Leuven, we're using GoData, which is a Notebreak investigation tool, which is very good for this purpose, as we can gather test results or vaccination status of users in real time. Then we also need some relevant data, and as Simone Delicourt has just said right now, collaboration with interdisciplinary domains is very important. And so it's very important for computer scientists to collaborate with epidemiologists to spot which kind of data we need to focus on and to actually gather. And finally, the third condition is that we have to collect enough data to build reliable models to actually draw some conclusions from this model. And so it means that we have to gather data as soon as possible. And so to conclude, I would say that emergency is not an issue at all if we have a strategy and we know how to gather the data. In short.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And the other aspects that Professor Delicourt said was the interdisciplinary framework that was needed to solve this kind of wicked problem. And so maybe I will ask successively Professor Noé, Professor Suttens, and Professor Vallena to react on that based on the experience that you had in the working group that you were leading during this COVID-19 pandemic. So maybe what should be done and what should have been done to take more into account this interdisciplinary approach and And in terms of structural limitations, what are the structural limitations that render this approach maybe difficult or not optimal? So maybe first Professor Noé.
Okay, the context in which data is gathered is very important. That's also something that Simon already mentioned. If you even in a pandemic, the context will constantly change. Your strategy changes on who you will test and so on. So having the context in which the data was collected is very important. Otherwise, if you just throw the data together, you will come to the wrong conclusion. So I think we definitely learned, and also policymakers and other stakeholders, that and documenting the data is very important. But I think that will not solve the issue in the sense that if there would be a next pandemic, it's again very important to have this interdisciplinary approach. It will not be just giving AI people data and then hoping that the problem will be solved. I often say, and lecture number 1 in AI is talking to the expert, understanding the problem of the expert, and knowing also the knowledge. We constantly talking about data. AI is not only data driven, and there's also a lot of modeling of knowledge that we can do in AI. We need to have this interdisciplinary team, and of course, that's not so easy if an emergency happens to bring the right people together with the right tools. But I think that's what should be done, and maybe then at the university, I agree, all the knowledge is there, but not always the way we work, in the sense that if you want to have people teaming up in an interdisciplinary team in an emergency setting, then maybe they should be released from other duties. That's very practical aspects that then come into play, because right at the beginning of the pandemic, the professors also had to switch to online teaching and so on.
No, I said starting point. I didn't want to say that everything has to be done within the university, but I think because there are a lot of expertise within those kind of institutions
and research
a
centers,
starting point.
Sure. Yeah, but maybe we should then dare to think about a bit out of the box of how can we bring these people together. So how can we then maybe free them from some other tasks, so that they actually have time to sit together, to work together, and to understand the problem, and to see what tools do we have already available, and that we can then combine somehow. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe Professor Suttens, you can continue.
Yeah, a very interesting discussion. And when I look at what we did in our working group in GPA, we discussed that structural problem and wrote a report about that. And we came to the conclusion that there is a need for new open science, open source, open data ecosystem in which governments invest in multidisciplinary research, especially in health applications of AI, where there is currently insufficient commercial interest and investment. And the current ecosystem is not responding sufficiently where it's not lucrative. And internationally funded projects should be coordinated and managed over the longer term by creating a permanent international non-profit organization or leveraging an existing one. So that was one of our most important recommendations when we talked about solving the structural problem, including the data problem that was discussed a moment ago. So an open science, open source, open data ecosystem, and the solution there is an international non-profit organization, not necessarily in one place. It can be located at several places all over the world, but it should be coordinated.
Thanks a lot. And maybe Professor Vaiana, what about the ethical framework and the legal framework? Is it sufficient from the moment? And how is it possible maybe to improve it for the future?
Well, I think another lesson that we had is we have some theoretical frameworks, but what was difficult was to actually translate them and act on them in practice. And I think that's an issue we saw across the board of ethical issues in the pandemic, not only the ones related to technology, but also the ones that were on public health ethics, just, you know, non-technological intervention type of things. So I think what we need to do is, of course, still keep working on some of our ethical frameworks. We do have a lot of theory developed, but think more carefully and plan more and focus more on how we can operationalize the frameworks and how we can translate them into action when we need the action to happen. And one way to do that could be procedural. We should have some better processes in place that we can activate when we need, because, for example, you know, we have a crisis. I mean, in many places we didn't have and I'm not talking about universities, we drew from universities because that's where our experts are, but many governments, for the first time, they thought, okay, maybe we need to have an ethicist in the room to think along with us about certain things. That shouldn't be, you know, ad hoc. We should have some of these things, at least as a process, already thought them through. I don't think the pandemic was the one and only crisis and we should be, you know, relaxed for the next 100 years. I think we are, unfortunately, in a situation that will have more and more things that require urgent attention. So formalize a little bit in the process that we should then go into when, you know, the need arises. I think it's important. But what I would like to caution us is that in the last several years, we've seen not a lack of thinking about the ethics of AI. We're thinking a proliferation of AI thinking, ethics thinking. Everybody's doing AI ethics, if you ask me. So the question is, what does it take to go from all this AI ethics enthusiasm to actually have in place something that we can use when we have to make those decisions when it comes, you know, into the case that matters? That's where I think we should focus, and that's how we should prepare for what's coming next.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we are quite close to the end of this very interesting roundtable. Maybe just a last question for Magda. In terms of the impact of AI on the pharmaceutical industry, what do you think it will be?
Well, you know, so I think AI will have, and it already has, a huge impact on pharma. And in fact, all large companies are embracing an AI and investing heavily in the talent and the data infrastructure, compute capabilities, and all, you know, that kind of fundamental work that is required for AI. And it's really already used at every stage. So, you know, there are models that automatically go through, I don't know, vast amounts of scientific literature to automatically identify interesting targets, find cure diseases. There are other models that then design molecules that will bind to these targets, that predict the safety and efficacy, what kind of reactions can be used to produce them, and so on and so on. This is already happening, and it's there to accelerate research and development. And I think what we learned from this pandemic is that we need to be even, you know, much quicker compared to where we are today, both in terms of time it takes to do preclinical research, in terms of how efficient we are when we run clinical trials, when we apply and obtain regulatory approvals. Generally, when it comes to organizational efficiency when interacting with regulatory bodies, this is, I think, a big topic. And finally, we need to get better around manufacturing and supply chain. So in the context of vaccines in particular, you know, you can have the vaccines, but it doesn't necessarily need to translate to vaccinations. So first, you need to get the vaccines out there to patients' arms, and they are very fragile substances. So you typically need this, you know, very, very demanding cold chain to do and roll out effectively. And we know that too much of this valuable material is really wasted, and wasting something like 20% is not very uncommon. So all of this had been known before, but I think there was a real spotlight on this during the COVID. So now we know how really important the rollout is. So, but still, we have witnessed several companies and manufacturers deliver several different COVID vaccines in less than a year, and this is really an unprecedented achievement. And yeah, just like the previous speaker, I think we all know that COVID is probably not the last pandemic that we're going to deal with, and if the next one comes, I think AI is going to be, really play a fundamental role in terms of, a quick and efficient response from the pharmaceutical industry perspective.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you to all of you. Actually, I think we have covered a quite vast amount of matter on the use of AI within a pandemic. So maybe now we can switch to the Q&A session. So for the audience, do not hesitate to ask your questions inside the chat, or either on Zoom or on YouTube. I've seen that we have already even three questions. So the first one is, where do you draw the limit between the classical algorithm used in advanced statistics for decades and true AI models? Maybe, I don't know, maybe Anne-Noe, you can answer to this question. It's not really linked with the pandemic in itself, but
yeah, it's indeed it's sometimes a thin line, and I think it also doesn't really matter where exactly we draw the line, but there is of course techniques. I mentioned, for example, agent-based models, can also be connections to game theory and so on, which are clearly not the statistical models as we used to know them. But I think it's yeah, you have to make the right choice of a methodology for the every problem has a right methodology, or some possible methodologies to solve the problem. So I would rather embrace the fact that there is overlap rather than saying where does one field ends and where does the other one starts. But knowledge representation, knowledge modeling, and so on is also part of AI, which is then not really part of a statistical approach, but definitely between all these fields there is overlap, and very often things are developed in AI, and once we often say that once some AI method works, it's no longer considered to be AI. So once it works, but yeah, there is of course a link. Definitely, if you talk about machine learning, and there's something like statistical machine learning. So yeah, of course, these methods do overlap in that area for sure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There is also another question more on the societal aspect. So maybe Professor Sutens, you will be able to answer based on the focus of the GPAI on this kind of questions. It's also a question that we completely didn't talk about during the roundtable, is how can AI help the education sector during the pandemic? And are there applications with regard to this aspect? It's maybe a bit far from what we discussed, but.
You mean for the education sector?
Yes, apparently the person just wanted to know what was the impact of AI on the education sector during the pandemic. I don't know if you have some insight about that, or if someone else.
Well, are we talking here about the measures taken by governments to mitigate the pandemic and the effect on the education sector, or what exactly?
To be honest,
because of course you can. There are several papers in which you can see the effect when you close schools and closing schools turns out not to be the let's say the decision with the with the maximum effect. So everybody thinks, at least in the beginning of the pandemic, that if we close schools, the pandemic will certainly reduce, but that's proven not to be true. So you can, by looking at some simulations that were done with these AI tools, it was shown that school closures are not, let's say, the first thing to do. And that was something that was also interesting for me. I didn't expect that, but that was one of the decisions.
Do you make reference to the study performed by the Imperial College?
I think so. Yes, there was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one question.
Initially, it was. They did two studies actually, and they changed that. And in their second study, that was what I saw in their conclusions.
It was very interesting. But for instance, I think that even the second study was performed considering a time frame without the alpha variant, which is also a new parameter. So I can agree with the conclusion of that study before the alpha variant, but maybe that one, I would have been interested to see the exact same framework with, the alpha and delta variant eras.
And also the context in the school was totally different than in the beginning. So everybody knew in the school that they had to make clusters, that they had to keep distance as good as possible. Even wearing masks was already, let's say, very well known in schools. So the situation was totally different at that moment. Yeah.
So now, last but not least question, very interesting. I think it's maybe for Professor Vallena. So do you think it's possible to have an internationally accepted framework of AI applications and systems in terms of surveillance or tools that predict the spread of the virus, considering the fact that the countries have different philosophies in terms of data and of privacy?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, especially in the moment we're living right now. But I think there should be an aspiration for this, and maybe the aspiration could also come or begin to come from the technical kind of level. We've seen a lot of progress in consortia and coalitions around big data efforts. So I don't think it's probably realistic to say, the whole world will sign up to this, but I think we might see some agreement, at least at regional areas. And I think in Europe, I have to say, we did see a lot of convergence in many issues that were quite critical during the pandemic. So I'm optimistic that we can keep trying to establish at least some. We're not going to have the entire thing, working for everybody, but I think we could establish at least some. We can agree on the principles, we can agree on some basic frameworks, and then at least we have at least a basic common understanding. And regional is probably going to work better than global, I think.
Okay, thanks a lot. Well, thank you. I think we are at the end of this roundtable. First, thank you, of course, to all of you, to all of the panelists. But also, I wanted to thank the people in the shadows. So Joyce, Anne Quinto, and Karl Merck from FARI, but also Casper Karpa, who was the technical support from BOSA, from SPF BOSA for this event, and also the general public that attended to this event, either on Zoom or on YouTube. And finally, last but not least, I'm very pleased to give the floor now to Nathanael Ackerman, the chairman of this wonderful European AI Week 2022 to conclude. Nathaniel, the floor is yours. You have to switch on your microphone.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and thank you all for being there. It was an outstanding panel. I have a few key messages listening to you, so we can see that AI can tackle many aspects of the pandemics, from the fast development of vaccine to the modeling of the epidemiological dynamic or diagnosis based on chest CT scan, and the list goes on. But it's also important to reflect on the lessons learned. And the first thing that comes to mind is that COVID-19 gave an incredible opportunity to boost the use of this set of technologies in the medical field. The epidemiological method, the diagnosis tools, and the pharmaceutical companies will undoubtedly take advantage of the use of AI during COVID to systematize its use in a broad range of situations. However, facts show that hospitals are not yet fully prepared to handle tools based on AI efficiently. At this point, and we have discussed AI techniques, but we have also discussed the question related to data gathering. We need to develop a more interdisciplinary collaboration, that has been said also, and we should probably rethink the way we train the students and the people working in this situation. Another point that was stressed is really the ethical aspect. So I think that is one of the main goal of the AI Act that is under discussion in the European Parliament, and that's why I would like also to invite you to follow tomorrow the session on the trustworthy AI assessment tool that we are developing in Belgium with the AI Ethics and Law Working Group within AI for Belgium, meaning we will concretely use the ethics guidelines and the ALTAI suggested by the high-level expert group on a concrete use case and make the questions more concrete, know who has to answer which question at what moment of the development. So we will present tomorrow the first phase of the development of this tool. I don't know if I was clear enough, but I would like to thank you. I have another point in my mind. I think this crisis has shown that there is a lack of public understanding of the scientific method in general. So more than ever, the main challenge is probably the training and education for the 21st century. So I would like to thank you all and invite you to participate to the European AI Week. You know that there are tomorrow and after tomorrow also big events in Dubai organized by the Commission. So we are in partnership in that. The first track for the European AI Week organized by AI for Belgium, meaning all the ecosystem, Flanders, Brussels, and Wallonia, is health, the health sector. And we had at the beginning of this afternoon a moonshot session saying, okay, Belgium could develop its competencies, or no, could prioritize the health as the first sector and push it more to welcome the research or the investment in AI. So sorry, I'm a bit tired. I would like to thank you to be there. I would like to thank Pierre for his organization, and Carl from FARI, Joyce Quinto. So the whole ecosystem in Belgium that has realized, that has built this European AI Week with 99 even in 1 week, 400 speakers, more than 30 countries participating. That's just crazy. And we will do it next year in a less startup mode, but okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathanael, and thank you to all of you. Have a nice evening. Bye.